collaborator in this Art and Conversation series. It'll be happening monthly, every Super Saturday. So save the date, 2 p.m. every Super Saturday until November. We'll be having ongoing conversations on the subject of the Hawaii Triennial and the artists and artworks in the exhibitions. And so we're here today with two lovely people. We're here to honor first, this new space, the Turnaround Gallery, is now home to the work of Ed Greevy and Haunani Trask. Their collection of photos are part of a book called Ku'e, 30 Years of Land Struggle in Hawaii. And that was at Honolulu Museum of Art, and it's now here. Feels like it's come home, almost, and that this show is now complete. So, mahalo to our curators, to Melissa Chu, Miwako Suzuka, and to Drew Carolina Broderick, who worked tirelessly to get this entire festival, visual arts exhibition, multi-site, citywide exhibition together. So I'd like to introduce our two speakers today, Tanigawa and Ed Greevy. I actually met both of you years ago through my work as exhibition manager for Contact. It was, I think it was 2015 or 2016 when I first met you as an award-winning journalist covering arts and culture in Hawaii for Hawaii Public Radio. I then got to know you as an amazing artist. And now, little plug, I know you as a friend and a collaborator and a co-curator. Noi and I we were working on an exhibition together called Where I Live, Houseless in Honolulu, which is currently on view at Arts and Letters in Uanu until July 24th, which features the work of 5 houseless or formerly houseless artists living across the urban core in Kaka'ako, San Island, Waikiki. I think that's it. So if you have a chance, please check out that exhibition, which looks at housing and houselessness in Hawaii. And Mr. Ed Greevy, who's with us today. Ed, your work, your photographs have been ingrained, have been seared into my mind since the 90s, learning about our history in Hawaii, our history of struggle and resistance, which began in the late 60s with Kalama Valley. And here we sit amidst many stories, many mo'olelo, many histories that have all come together in this space and time. And I would be remiss to not also honor Haunani Trask, whose words really enliven and contextualize each of these photos. We just came up on a year since her passing in July. And Haunani's words and her legacy, I think, live in all of us today. Those of us who love Hawaii and call this place home. So, very excited for this conversation. There's a lot of overlap in actually the journalistic and the documentary nature of the work that you both do, capturing the stories of Hawaii and translating them to all of us. So, mahalo for being here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Just joining us in just that way. It's not just what he says, it's how he does it. Hey, all right, Ed. Nice to see you.
Oh, thank you.
It really is. The last time we had a chance to talk was when you had an exhibiting at Kapiolani Community College. They're just just dozens of paintings in photographs in Lama Library. This is a terrific representative sample. And it was really cool that Josh kind of positioned us there with Kalama Valley as a moment in time for the state, one that Haumani K pinpointed as the start of the modern Hawaiian movement, and you were there documenting the start of the Kalama Valley protests. Get us going with that. What was it like in Honolulu then? What was the scene like, Ed?
Well, from my point of view, as a graduate from Long Beach State College,
Political science major.
political science major, and so I paid attention, and I still do, to larger political events or larger events that affect many people. And I also was a surfer when I was younger, and very dedicated. I was never really good at it, but I really liked to do it. And I measured the value of a day by how many hours I was in the water. If I was in the water 8 hours or longer, it was a good day. If I was in the water less than that, that meant the waves weren't that good, and it wasn't a good day. And along the way, with my sister and brother-in-law and my first wife, we published a surf magazine out of Connecticut in the 70s. And but I had been to Hawaii before that, and I really wanted to come back here because I liked it. And so after we came back, and I was working for Pan Am, and I got a letter from a friend I had met in the surf business back east. He had relocated to surfing magazine editor in, I guess in the 70s.
International surfing.
International surfing. And he said that surfers were becoming environmentally conscious, and they had heard about something called Save Our Surf, and he wanted to know more about it. So as it turned out, the next day I was in a camera store in Waikiki, Lawrence Hata, and there was a poster, a handmade, one-of-a-kind poster for Save Our Surf. And I called the number that was on the poster, and it turned out to be the home of John and Marion Kelly, who I became good friends with. And John was really my mentor from early on. He was so adept at so many things.
He was really just such a standout figure of the time, right? I mean, he's kind of, are people familiar with John Kelly, son of, yes, the legendary printmaker? He grew up in Black Point, grew up surfing, and politically involved.
At one point when my son was, he was about 18, I think he was still in high school, I set him up to go swimming with John Kelly at Black Point to point out the good fishing spots. And afterwards, my son and John was like 10 years older than me, so there was a big age gap difference. But after they did the swim, I asked my son how it went, and he said, "Oh, I could hardly keep up with that guy Kelly. He could really swim." John was very adept at many things, and he had his own printing press that was under his house. He always used to tell me, the only free press is the one that you own. And it's kind of whimsical, but it's partially true.
Well, it was part of his clout at the time, having control of that media. And, because he could get the word out. It was one of the few ways of getting the word out. Leaflets, actual physical leaflets in those days, flyers,
right.
And so on.
He got started by somebody, a print shop gave him a used printer that he needed to take apart and clean. And he didn't know how to use it. And he taught himself how to use the printer. And he started doing it. I became sort of his field photographer. I didn't charge anything for the film or time because most of the people that he was printing for were poor. And it was photographing and documenting their situation, whatever it was. Mostly it was evictions, was my way to contribute to what these people were trying to do, which was to stay in their homes. They didn't have money to buy advertising or other promotional things to get their point across. So John represented a way to get that done because commercial printers in that time in the 70s would not print political material of any kind. So which is why John had a print shop under his house, because he could print anything he wanted. And go ahead.
It's people needing to know, and him knowing who to tell, for one thing. He had a reputation for the kinds of projects that he got involved in, and that kind of set a trajectory for your work as well. Talk about the movements that he got you hooked up with. You know, it starts out with surfers concerned about actually development issues. It's sand replenishment in Waikiki. So that starts out as a surfing issue. But then he gets involved in actually, farming, agriculture, land rights.
There came a time when I was helping out and going to Save Our Surf meetings. They met most of the time at Kaimuki Library. And there came a time when John announced to the group that they had won most of their battles involving surfing, but there were a lot of other social issues that he felt that statehood had generated because of the better investment point of view that was in the world. Anyway, he announced to the crowd, maybe 3 times as big as what's here today, mostly teenage kids, that they had prevented the widening of Waikiki. They lobbied for a sewage plant, which now exists, and there was a number of other plans for seawalls and other things that interfered with surfing that were pushed back. We even did a protest demonstration on the announced plans for a 5,000 to 7,000 housing development at Sandy Beach, of all places. And I think there's a picture here of Terry Kiko'olani with that wind blowing her hair.
Right here.
Yeah.
Terry Kiko'olani, right here. That's the demonstration at Vavamalu there on the east end.
That was taken at the demonstration I'm talking about.
Yep.
And I never got another shot like that.
Oh, yeah,
The
that's
wind never,
classic.
acted right. But anyway, so I was initially just investigating Save Our Surf for an old friend from the surfing magazine days.
So that became a development issue. And the land struggles also were development issues. And the whole thing with Kalama Valley was, remember the time, this wasn't, back of the newspaper type, and this is front page stuff, and it was leading in the television news and everything, because, I don't know, the tenor of the times was somehow different. You were saying that there would be so many protests going on in a single day that you couldn't cover them all. And it was, of course, your goal to try to document all.
I tried that, and I realized there are events that are happening at the same time on different sides of the island.
How frustrating for you, but it was a time, right?
Well, John announced to everybody that they had won most of the main reason why Save Our Surf existed. But he was going to continue the struggle, so to speak, for other poor people that had been discovered, so to speak, but didn't have surfing issues. They had housing issues. And he announced to the crowd of people there, the SOS group, that he was going to stay and to help these people avoid being kicked out of their house that they had lived in for most of their lives.
And thus Kalama Valley happened. And it was, it was a focal point because it was land owned by Bishop Estate, development planned by Henry J. Kaiser, who was developing Hawai'i Kai. In fact, did I see Gary Pack, Merle Pack earlier today? They made a really wonderful video about this. It's definitely worth seeing. Fascinating time that brought all these great players against, and it was a David and Goliath picture against George Santos. You met George Santos. Tell us a little bit about him.
Well, George had been
big farmer.
He was in his 60s, I would guess, and he had never been big time, so to speak. He had a few pigs. He had been evicted from other piggeries until he was at Kalama Valley, and in his view, there was nowhere left to be evicted to. It was the end of the line. And so he just sort of announced, I remember when it was in the newspaper, it was a picture of him with a gun across his lap, and he said, "Hell no, I ain't moving."
Yeah.
And Joy On.
And look who he was facing off. Law enforcement certainly was out there, right, for that standoff?
Joy On later told me that she was substitute teaching in Waianae. Joy On has passed away. But she wasn't political, but she reads the newspaper, and she sees that picture of George Santos, who looked very much like somebody that was in her circle of friends. And she sees that he says, "Hell no, I ain't moving." And so she dropped everything from where she was teaching and moved in to Kalama Valley and became totally focused on social, political issues the rest of her life. She's since passed away. But
Was that can you explain how people were in those days? They did things like that?
well, things have changed to a great degree. A lot of people, Haunani and I used to talk about this too. She was very disappointed that there weren't other younger people that had developed the point of view that she had, and others who put political work ahead of everything else. And I always would tell her, my position was always, large political movements are never straight line. They happen fits and from time to time you move forward and then you move backward. And suddenly when you didn't realize it, a good for instance was George Helm and the group that started the movement at the PKO.
Protect Kaho'olawe.
Protect Kaho'olawe Ohana.
You're talking about George Helm?
They went there on their first attack, so to speak. Nobody knew about it. Everybody that I knew that was in the struggle, it took us by surprise because he didn't do anything before that to get known, so to speak. And everybody was glad to see something happening like that because.
How did you hear about it? Was it on the news?
Oh, it was front page news. When their first landing and occupation of the island, which was off limits to everybody, there were
because it was actively being
used
for target
it was
practice.
A dangerous place. Yeah. It was unexploded ordnance. And that's ostensibly why the military had taken it over, because it's a privately owned island. At the beginning of World War II, they needed a practice place that wasn't populated. They didn't have to pay anybody to move. And it was hard. people knew about it, but nobody really questioned the military presence or use of the island. World War II was long over until George Santos, and George Helm, and others
Yes.
occupied, and that started a whole movement. Even today, they're one of the few movements that I'm aware of that started in the 70s and still exist. Most of the eviction struggles, people would get involved if they were being evicted, and they would either end up negotiating to get housing somewhere else, or in many cases, they completely won, so to speak. But afterwards, and I have some European friends that criticize politics in Hawaii, that once everybody gets an issue resolved, like housing, they go back to what they were doing, and they're not like Europeans that are very political. And there's many other things in Europe that are commendable. He reads a lot of European newspapers. A place of this size in Europe would be 4 or 5 or more newspapers, all espousing different points of view.
Today, you're saying?
Today, yeah,
Today.
that's today.
I try to understand the seeming passivity of me, I guess, you know? It's,
Well,
at this time,
if you look back at the history of Hawaii, many other places, small places that Europeans discovered, so to speak, their political history is they were invaded by various European nations. It never really happened here.
wait a minute. You're talking about Hawaii never being invaded?
They didn't fight among themselves too much.
You know,
There were battles and wars between various islands, but not on the scale of some other places. So Hawaii, if you look at the culture in a broad sense, at least from my point of view, what I've learned, they're not into violence, they're not into power kinds of things. They don't resolve their issues among themselves with violence. So to me, there's a history here that goes back pre-contact. The Hawaiians were very at contact time, they were very well organized and had a system set up for handling disputes, because there were like 800,000 Hawaiians here when Cook arrived.
Oh, you mentioned Europeans, and you were negotiating a time when we were just discovering, it was sort of the time when the Hawaiian Renaissance was taking place, right? And it was the birth of Hawaiian language schools, and it was discovery of what being Hawaiian kind of meant. And alongside that, there was you somehow penetrated these really rootsy movements despite being Caucasian. What was that like for you?
Well, I had been here as a surfer in 1960 and 62. During college years, I spent some time, quite a bit of time here. And then later came back in 67 after I'd finished school. And I've been here pretty much ever since, with short periods on the mainland.
You had a very deep friendship with Haunani K. Trask.
Back in 40-some years ago, when the PKO, the Kaho'olawe issue was on everybody's mind, they had an organization that met periodically here in Honolulu. I was married at that time, to a Hawaiian woman. We had a son who was less than a year old. So we felt it important to be part of that movement, but that she should be the main participant in the group. And I would take care of my son when we went to meetings. So we went to a number of meetings, and there was a lot of discussion about things. And from my point of view, having lived in New York and worked in New York, and had an education, so to speak, much more poke in the eye with a sharp stick than I was comfortable with here. So I was pretty much remaking myself into a less assertive person. So one night at a meeting, in each of the PKO meetings, they'd have a different chairman, a chairperson. It could be a woman, it could be a man. And so to a great degree, what I observed was this organization may be more democratic than you normally see because they spread the leadership around, but they don't get a lot done. But that's up to them. That's not for me to tell them, you need to.
That was your sense at the time?
He was less than a year old. So one night, the chair, every time, they met about once a month. And so one night at a meeting, there was a new chair, and it was a woman I recognized the family name Trask, but other than that, I knew nothing about her personal history, just that there was a new person here, and she was somehow or other became the leader for that meeting. And in about 20 minutes time of me observing, I realized things are going to be different around here after she had arrived, because she was much more focused on getting things done. And as it turned out, separate from the PKO, she became a teacher involved in politics at the UH, and she crossed paths with Marion Kelly. Marion Kelly, in her own way, was as effective and as a change-making person as John was.
Marion Kelly, wife of John Kelly. She was she an archaeologist, anthropologist?
She was an anthropologist at the Bishop Museum. And I had gotten to know the Kellys from surfing. They crossed paths somehow and became friends, and Marion became her mentor.
Haunani K's mentor.
Haunani K's mentor. And she gave a number of speeches at public venues around town. And each one I would tell my then wife, my son's mother, things are going to be different around here.
You know what, Ed, it's really hard for people to know what Haunani K was like, and it's so hard to describe her. You know, I've got a little snippet of her here that I just wonder if we can take a listen to. It's from because what she was doing was explaining a new way of looking at the history of Hawaii and you know, a new way of looking at the present, in fact. So she did that day in and day out for decades. So this was actually recorded in 1990. It was a issues program run by the host here, Robert Reese.
We have another call waiting. Hello.
Let me just be sure that I have this for us here.
We have another call waiting. Hello.
Could I?
Hello.
Go ahead. What's your question, please?
My question concerns, you blame it on the white man on how we came over and take your land. I don't understand when the Japanese are coming over and they're buying it, and that's okay. I don't see what this is about the Howleys coming over. You come over to our country and buy up our land too. It works both ways. I don't see how you can have this rallies and everything against the white man. This is America, I
Let me
mean,
just say something to this call. This is not America. This is Polynesia. Our country was stolen. That's one of your problems. You're ignorant, woefully ignorant. I am very active against Japanese ownership of our land. I have testified repeatedly at various commissions and at the legislature in opposition to any foreigner owning Hawaiian land. But you, caller, need to learn about Hawaiian history and about where you are. And that attitude that you have is the same attitude that Joey Carter has. You think you are in America. You are not in America. You are in a colony that is in Polynesia that was forcibly taken, just as, I might add, all of Eastern Europe was forcibly taken by the Soviet Union, which Americans think is a very, very bad place. The bad, bad Soviet Union. Well, the bad, bad United States of America took Puerto Rico, it took Alaska, it stole Indian land, it took Hawaii, it took Guam, it took Micronesia, Palau, and you had better learn that history because you are the recipient of an imperialist tradition.
Kind of hit people hard.
Nani was the smartest person
We have another call waiting. Hello.
ever. And she was much different than the public image that the media portrayed her in. She evaluated everybody. She had the reputation of being anti-Howley, but she really wasn't. I mean, the man she lived with for many years was from the mainland, and he was Howley. He still is. But, and she was fearless. I mean, she wasn't afraid of anything or anybody. From time to time, a new issue would pop up that was that put her in the news, because the newspapers and the TV station news people, if they would see anything that might have to do with her, they would immediately run to her because they knew they would get a good quote. And from time to time, when she would tell me that there was an issue arising on the Joey Carter issue was one in particular. She was teaching at UH, and there was a graduate student who wrote a letter in the student newspaper complaining about being a Howley, and in Hawaii he interpreted that word totally negative, and he didn't like being called a Howley, and he felt that people should give him respect because he was a grad student in philosophy. So the newspaper published his letter, and she responded by telling him, in a nutshell, Pan Am and United had flights every day out of Hawaii to the mainland, and if he was really unhappy being a Howley here, he should get on one of those planes and leave. And when that was starting to become an issue, she told me about it, and I laughed, and I said, boy, you're going to generate, there's going to be a lot of heat generated over your position. And she couldn't wait. And I was thinking to myself, I'm glad it's not me, because I don't really want to take all the heat that's going to come down on her. She couldn't wait to move on and do battle with this guy over that issue.
And she did. She truly did. You know, her book, her seminal book, From a Native Daughter, Colonization and Sovereignty in Hawaii, still just reads like a punch to the stomach. And you mentioned what she was like more as a person as well, which was different. Those who met her knew her. I did not know her well, but she had the best smile. She could completely wrap you in. Wonderful person to exchange deeply with. And I think we can get a sense of that from her poetry collection, Night is a Sharkskin Drum. I recommend it to you. I think you'll like that perspective on her. And she kind of employs this Hawaiian way of incorporating physicality and into ideas. I guess it comes through maybe in melee as well. And I think it's a collection to enjoy.
David told me that there was some guy on the mainland who was somehow connected to Hawaii. He knew things that were happening here that were in the general news, but he used to call them up at 2 or 3 in the morning because he could never get his time straightened out. And he would just cuss the two of them out, call them all kinds of names, and at first, and threaten them. I mean, it was really, and she said they were kind of taken aback because it was so virulent. And he was clearly intoxicated when he'd make these calls. And he never called at a normal time period. They were always when you were normally sleeping. So it got to the point where they just laughed at him. And they would say, oh, it's so, they had a name for him. I don't remember what it was, but they said, oh, it's, you know, if the call came in at 2 in the morning, well, that's probably George or whatever his name. But she actually got a kick out of it after a while. I mean, it was very unnerving.
You know, these are times when it's almost as though you can't have certain kinds of relationships. They just don't happen between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. I mean, you know, there's something about going through stuff that people went through together in those days that really is so bonding. And with Haunani-He, okay, let's think, there was Stop H3. I mean, a massive, and in fact, it's so well documented out here, right? The whole Piliamomo set. I mean, your work in here is just resonating with everything in
That
these
image,
galleries.
I saw that. That was a favorite of John Kelly. When he print things, he would put that, because he preached that. Basically, that's get organized. You can take on a big fish, so to speak.
You mean this graphic here?
Yes.
It's great, isn't it? Yeah, it is. You also were there for the Mokawea fight there?
I'm sorry, which?
The fight off of Sand Island, Mokawea Island?
Yes. I spent a lot of time on both Sand Island and Mokawea. Mokawea was a fishing village, still is to some degree, right off of Sand Island. Mokawea is a natural island. Sand Island is man-made. And the Mokawea issue raised its head many times. The Department of Transportation that oversees places like Mokawea and Sand Island tried to evict the people who lived on Mokawea. You had to take a boat to get there because there's no land bridge. And the tenants would fight off evictions, and the state would issue eviction notices, post them to the houses, and then they would be gone. They would think everybody would leave. Well, some people would leave, but a lot of people stayed. So there developed a public issue for them to be evicted, and E.L.V. Wright was the head of the Department of Transportation. It was his job as an employee of the state because the airline, he claimed that the airlines were complaining that Mokawea is, after the reef runway was built, the pattern of takeoffs and landings to some degree was right over the island, and they were afraid that a jet plane would crash and kill a lot of people on Mokawea Island. So the state claimed that they were pushing the state to get rid of everybody who lived on the island. So that was the main issue, and it wound up, the state finally capitulated because E.L.V. Wright, the director of the department, got so frustrated at the pattern of posting notices of eviction on the door, on the houses that were built there. And then some people would leave, then they'd come back after a while.
And then there seems to be this pattern that happens where there's a protest, somehow it gets big enough that there are negotiations, and then some type of agreement is reached, a temporary lease is agreed to, or something they're maybe allowed to stay on some grounds for a limited amount of time. The Führer goes down, and nobody can remember what happened there.
E.L.V. Wright made a mistake. He got frustrated. So he posted eviction notices, then sent in a private contractor to set fire to the existing buildings. Because in his mind, the reason people left for a period of time and then came back because the state didn't follow through on their threats of incarceration. So he figured if he got rid of the houses, they'd have nothing to come back to. So he hired a private contractor to burn the, I remember seeing the smoke.
Now that attracted a lot of attention.
A lot of attention, and basically...
Almost like our Kent State, you know what I mean?
It was on that, because there was nothing they could say. That he had to admit that he had hired the contractor. And from then on, Kamokuea had support by virtually the whole island. Whether you were rich or poor, nobody thought it was fair to order somebody out of their house that was questionable whether or not the state had jurisdiction. That was another issue. And burn their house down. I mean, whether you were rich or poor, that was just not fair. So that's in that struggle, and I photographed there many times, because they just couldn't win. And finally they settled. They let 14 families who could prove historically that their forefathers and women had lived there a long time before even Cook arrived. So they gave them a 65-year lease for, I think it was $150 total per year, put in a water line, and said, we'll leave you alone.
The only way they could win was through the court of public opinion, which was swayed by photographs by people like you. I mean, that's why it's important to document this stuff, and you've done it to an incredible extent. You have documented, you've documented activism on Oahu at a time when people stood up against development. Now, I mean, this period somehow was followed by a time where, I don't know, what would you say, Ed? Suddenly people stopped demonstrating.
Well, times have changed. I'll give you an example in my field of photography. Back in the 70s and 80s, when I was more active, groups of people knew that they needed to get information out to other groups, and printing a leaflet or a flyer of some sort or a slideshow was how they would do it. But the digital camera, because most people in those days, unless you were a professional photographer, if you had a camera at all, you were likely to have a Kodak Instamatic that took okay color pictures, but it didn't do well. Those pictures did not translate well to black and white printing. So when I came along and showed some interest in documenting and taking pictures for literature like that, a lot of people, total strangers, would call me up and say, I was referred by so-and-so or John Kelly or somebody, and they would explain the issue. These were people from neighbor islands as well as here. And because they had a situation facing them that I was intellectually opposed to and just felt it was unfair, and these people needed a voice, and I tried to furnish that. And after a few years of doing that, I never threw anything away. I had this big collection of black and white negatives, and a few color slides. And I realized that's what Hanani and I did our first show. John Dominus Holt was a person who he founded a publishing company, and so he was in the business, and he was Hawaiian, as many of you will probably recognize his name. Hanani and I did a show, our first show together, that a local camera club that was active at the time announced that instead of their annual show being at downtown at the AmFac Center, was going to be at Ala Moana Center. That attracted me because I had this big collection of pictures and no place to put them, so to speak. But Ala Moana was attractive to me to show pictures because it had free parking. It wasn't downtown. And it appealed to a more wide spectrum, a wider spectrum of the community than the downtown galleries. So I entered the show, and I realized that my pictures, without captions, they don't mean that much to most people because they don't know what's going on in the picture. So I had already crossed paths with Hanani at the Kellys a few times, and I realized she could write. So I approached her and said, I have this show coming up that I'm going to be able to put about 40 prints in, and I need somebody to write captions. Are you interested? She just about jumped off out of her chair. She says, oh, am I interested? Of course I am. So that's really how we got to know each other, was producing that show. And from that, Ku'e eventually came about. During the preparation for that book, I was still working full-time in the insurance claims business. I had a young son that I was taking care of periodically, like every week. She took a semester off of teaching at the UH to research and interview people, because a lot of the eviction struggles had happened while Hanani was in school on the mainland. So she had to interview people to find out what their viewpoint was, and some of which we couldn't find. But we got as far as the Big Island. We interviewed Black Richards, who had been one of the last to leave at Kalama Valley. So the show was turned into a book. The publisher told us at the time it would never sell really big, but it would sell steadily for a long time. And that's pretty much turned out to be true. Ku'e, he printed 3,500 to start with, and I don't have any left. I have one left. But there are some bookstores in town. Namea is one. You can still usually find that book. Anyway.
Because these captions by Hanani are really, they nail it. They do. They go so well with the images.
Well, I thought it was a good, when we first met at the Kellys, because the state after Mokuea was all but finished, politically at least, the state turned to Sand Island and said, get out. You're not paying rent, and you're in the flight path, all the same arguments. So when the Kellys and others would go to Mokuea, we would usually catch rides from Sand Island fishermen in their small boats. So they got to know what we were doing, and they saw success. So when the state gave eviction notices to the Sand Island residents, their leadership, Puhi Pao mainly, approached John Kelly, because he had given him rides many times, and said, we're being evicted now, can you help us? Because from their point of view, the Kellys had been very successful at Mokuea. So John told him he and Marion weren't finished with the struggle. They were building a fish pond on Mokuea, and this wasn't finished, but he and Marion couldn't take on another project, but they would find a crew to help out. And how and why they chose me and Dwight Kondo and Hanani Trask as the crew. So Hanani couldn't be there during the day because she was teaching, and I could only go there periodically. But Dwight wasn't working, and so he spent a lot of time out there.
And you turned out to be a terrific trio to really dig into those issues. You know, we're coming here to the end of our time, and so I'd like to offer up to questions if there are any out there. You know, anybody has something for that? About the times, about the photos themselves, about the people you might have known. Yeah, all those personalities at the time. Emmett O'Leary, who was with the Technical Hawaii Ohana, Daviana McGregor, also with PKO. Puhi Pao, you mentioned, Joe Lander with Navakal Aina, whose work is in the gallery over there.
I think she was credited with a film I told you about coming in here. And I would say, as much as any other event, the Kalama Valley situation that happened on Bishop Estate land that was supposed to be used for the benefit of Hawaiians. Didn't turn out that way, but that was the intent. It did more to galvanize and awaken people to, because at the same time there was the so-called Hawaiian Renaissance was happening, and more people with a Hawaiian background sort of came out of the woodwork and were asserting they were dancing more in the old style.
Performance appeared.
Right, and Hawaiians were just feeling, in general, they weren't the only ones, but they were, as much or more than any other ethnic group, they were becoming aware of their history that had been lied to for many years. A good example was Twiggs Smith. Do you remember Twiggs Smith? He was the one that owned, at one time he owned the Advertiser. He was very outspoken to defending the status quo. And he used to say, well, why are you Hawaiians complaining now when back in at the time of annexation, Hawaiians didn't oppose annexation. In fact, it's been very good for Hawaiians. And then Noe Silva, doing research at the Smithsonian Library, I think, was asked by one of the librarians, oh, by the way, we have these boxes, dust-covered boxes full of we don't know what, but it says Hawaii on it, and you're doing research on another Hawaii project here. Do you want to see what's in these boxes? And she said, oh, yeah, I'm interested. Turned out to be the petitions.
Petitions.
And it disproved Twiggs Smith's statement that Hawaiians loved annexation. And
there was just so much going on at the time. I mean, Ed, do you have any wise words for photographers of today? How, with such a richness to choose from, of things to take photos of, what have you found is meaningful later?
I'm sorry, what?
What have you found is worth taking a photo of later? What have you found is valuable to choose in an image?
Well, when I was growing up, I always wanted a good camera. I couldn't afford. I'm from Southern California, working class family. My father was a carpenter, so we were poor, but we weren't destitute. But I always wanted among other things, I wanted and I was saving up till I finally went to Japan and bought a Nikon, but that was many years later. Anyway, through experience of just living and going to college, I found that large political movements occur over a period. They seldom happen in one day or 1 week. They occur when there's a need. It will take time for people to figure out how to resolve the issue, but eventually it happens. And so when it looked like the Hawaiian movement was fizzling out here, I used to tell Haunani, you cannot predict where major political movements, of which the Hawaiian movement is, in my opinion, you have good reasons to feel upset about what has happened in the past and is still continuing to happen. But you can't expect it. It moves forward and it goes back and it moves forward. And events that you can't predict at the time, or at any particular time, happen and change everything. And since Hawaiians have a legitimate beef, so to speak, they will be at the forefront again. But it's hard to predict when. So if I would give any advice to, I'd say just hang on, do the best you can at what you do, and be ready to take a forward position, unlike what's going on today with Trump trying to go, and the whole movement on the right these days, trying to make the world 1935 again, or whatever. So you just have to keep at it and hope that something happens to try to keep up with the venue that you've chosen. I'll add a couple of things. At different times, I was approached by Puhi Pao, for one, and Sparky Rodriguez. Does anybody know who Sparky Rodriguez is? He lives in Waianae, and both of them, and there were, over the Makua issue, which I'm going to have an exhibit, by the way, from my Makua work, starting next month, I think, in a different location in the Downtown Art Gallery. Anyway, Puhi Pao approached me at Sand Island. He was a kind of unelected spokesperson for Sand Island, and he said he had watched me work. There was another two-person team, a woman named Vicky. Do you remember Vicky?
Two-person.
She had a Japanese last name. She was haole, but anyway, there was a team, Rocheford. Their last name was Rocheford, Vicky and Jerry. They made us a video of the Sand Island struggle. So they were often in the Sand Island area when I was there taking pictures, so we knew each other. And she approached and said, oh no, it was Puhi Pao approached me and said he wasn't media savvy, didn't own a camera, but he had become turned on, so to speak, by the politics of Sand Island and what he had learned. And he wanted to get involved in the media end of things. What would I recommend? I was a still photographer, and he was trying to decide whether to acquire a still camera or a movie camera. And what did I think? Or what did I suggest? And I laughed and said, the future of the world from a media standpoint is video, is not still cameras, not still photography. So he got heavily involved in that, and there's a major program at Waianae High School devoted to educating students in video, as well as other computers and video. And then the other, Puhi Pao had the same discussion with me, and he crossed paths with Joan. I had met her before. She's been in video a long time. And
He's in the gallery.
So he went to Olelo. They have some rules about access to, they're a nonprofit that has to provide a certain amount of access to their equipment to the community to keep a hold of the nonprofit status. So that's he went to Puhi Pao went to them, checked out a movie camera, and
The rest is history.
the rest is history. And they stayed together a long time.
For these personal reminiscences of people that are featured in the museum right now. Really, it's been so great talking with you, and thank you so much for your work, which has throughout amplified the voices of those less heard, the voices really you might not otherwise have gotten to hear. Thank you so much, Ed.